you're back for another adventure in Australian literature. Welcome. So before we get started, here are templates. I think we can see that this time. And of course, book to help with you writing your great Australian novel. So remember, links are down below. And also the newsletter, the Black Cockie Press newsletter is available. There's a link down below for that. Just go to the website and there's a box that you can fill in, put your email address in, and you will get 2 emails per month. Just keeping you up to date with everything that Black Cockie Press is doing, because we have a very exciting year. Now, I'm going to do something a little bit different today. Normally we talk about a specific book or a specific author. I actually want to talk to you about a specific way of writing that is probably applicable across the board, but I do notice it in Australian writing very, very much, and it has a big impact on, I think, because I notice it more with Australian writing than other writing, because I'm not familiar with other countries, whereas when I read Australian literature, I'm reading my own country and I notice this, and it's really jarring. So if you're writing Australian literature, I want to talk to you. Or if you're writing any kind of writing, I'm talking to you as a writer about why some things work and some things don't work. Now, what I'm talking about is a sense of place. So, this book, which I cannot talk about in any other way apart from this way, because it's a book I've actually, I have an unhealthy relationship to this book. I honestly have an unhealthy relationship to this book. I have read it more than once, generally in the hope that somehow, having been smooshed onto my bookcase through osmosis with other books, it may improve. It hasn't. I've got to stop reading it. I feel like it feels I think I'm in an abusive relationship with this book. Why? Why? Now, if this were anything else than this, then what I'm going to explain, I would have read it, I would have tossed it, I would have just, that you're going to a bus stop. That's actually what I do with books that I really, really don't want. I take them to bus stops and leave them there. I set them free. But this book is set in Katoomba. Not only is this book set in Katoomba, it doesn't get it right. Like, it genuinely doesn't get it right. And that's what I want to actually talk about. What happens, how do you use place in Australian writing? Because one of the things that is really, having read a lot of Australian books, is sense of place is fundamentally important in the way that our books work. We have a very strong sense of place. We have, I think I explained this in my first video on Australian literature, but we are very, our writers are very regional, so that a writer from Queensland doesn't sound like a writer from New South Wales, who doesn't sound like a writer from Victoria, who certainly doesn't sound like a writer from Tasmania, who doesn't sound like South Australia, who doesn't sound like Western Australia, who doesn't sound like Northern Territory. Canberra, I don't think, has a particularly strong voice, but everywhere else, oh boy, they have very different. Western Australia is one of the weirdest I've seen of all of the different states. Western Australia is like, they're almost American. They're weird. I mean, it's so distant to us in New South Wales. I mean, thanks to COVID. We learnt their Premier's name. This is cruel and unnatural. It is unnatural to know the Premier of Western Australia's name if you live in New South Wales and vice versa. Wrong, bad things. But Western Australia has the weirdest. South Australia has the least distinct. Tasmania, oh my goodness. Oh wow. They're... We'll get to a Tasmanian writer at some point. We will do them. But I'm used to New South Wales writers. That's not the problem with this. She is a New South Wales writer. But one of the things that you notice with Australian writers, on top of being regionally, as in statewide, having a particular voice, Australian writers are also very, very linked to place. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that place is really strongly evoked in Australian novels. So that if you look at the last video I did where I talked about For Love Alone is very steeped in Sydney. This book was written in the 1940s, and yet having walked through Sydney in the 21st century, even though there are much bigger buildings, it looks very different. It's still Sydney. It's still that humid, swampy atmosphere of a Sydney summer. It is just so Sydney. You can see it, you can taste it, you can smell it. It's Sydney. That's one way of doing place in Australia, is evoke it so much that you are just there. You not only can you see it, you are in it. Now that's what really good evoking of place can do. And that's what most Australian writers will do, is they will write a place that they understand, that they know, that is theirs. And now that will make it sound incredibly parochial. It's not actually parochial. It's not that Australian writers are writing about a place because they are incapable of writing about other places or incurious about other places. It just seems to be something a quality that Australian writers have, that they will write about where they are. Which brings me back to this book. This one writes about Katoomba, but having read it and having lived most of my life in Katoomba, the Katoomba in this book and the Katoomba that I walk are not the same. It's really hard to have that immersive sense when you sort of get a sense that, oh, you spent 2 weeks up here once, didn't you? And then you did things off a map and photographs, didn't you? Yeah, that's what happens when you have characters walking up streets that you know. Not only would you not walk up that street doesn't have a footpath. It's one thing for a writer to exaggerate, like Clive James with the Billy Cart Hill, that is on a much less of a gradient than the story implies. But it's another thing when you are writing something and it rings false. When you are driving past a list of guest houses when, hang on, they're not on the same street. You can't actually drive that way, but oh, those all have nice names. It becomes a real problem. There is an alternative way of doing this, and that is what Patrick White does in The Solid Mandala. He actually has several books that are all set in what is actually Castle Hill, where he was living at the time. But he didn't call it Castle Hill, not since his first novel, which he wrote about. He wrote that and he set it in the Snowy Mountains, and then he didn't allow it to be published again in his lifetime because he felt that he had gone a little bit too close to nature. He'd used real people, and he was just, I think I pushed that a little bit too far, too close. And so he disguised where he lived and called it Sarsaparilla. Everyone knows Sarsaparilla is Castle Hill. Everybody knows that the place he is writing about is a real place. It's not an imaginary place, but he hasn't called it Castle Hill. So you read it and you still get a sense of place, but the sense of place is called Sarsaparilla. This book would really have benefited from doing that. In fact, when you look at Patrick White, you can see what happens when a writer tries writing something that doesn't evoke, an Australian writer especially, write something that where place isn't evoked very well, which is in his, I believe it's his second novel, The Living and the Dead, which is set in London. And Patrick White knew London. He knew London. But the book is just, it just feels like every other interwar period English novel. Even White himself found it like, that didn't come off right, that didn't work. Not in the way he intended it to. His next novel was The Art Story, and that comes back to Australia. It doesn't stay in Australia. He does take it to Europe and he does take it to America, and those parts work fine. However, after that one, his novels are in Australia. And his Australian novels are by far absolutely his strongest. The Solid Mandala is set in Sarsaparilla. I think The Tree of Man, when I read The Tree of Man, I felt it was set up in Scone, up that sort of area where the White family had pastoral leases, though it could easily have also been in the Castle Hill area, just given the proximity to Sydney and things that are in it. But it's more of it's never specified exactly where it is in The Tree of Man. The Riders in the Chariot is also set in Sarsaparilla. Sarsaparilla is, it turns out, a remarkably elastic place. It can be whatever he wants it to be, which is why he invented it. It's sort of the universal Australian place. It's both suburbia and semi-rural and close enough to more industrialised areas. It is capable of being many different things. It's quite an elastic concept, sarsaparilla. And that is what I wish she did. I wish she had created an invented tourist town, because she doesn't have enough sense of place to set it in place. And you can tell when you get used to reading Australian books and you get used to how strongly they evoke place, you really notice it when it doesn't work. I'm going to try and avoid reading this again. I really am, because I swear it's not good for me. Not good for me. The other thing I would say about this is that the female characters are not strong enough. Considering that I have just said in my last video that one of the big tropes of Australian literature, especially Australian literary fiction, which is what we pretty much look at exclusively here, is brave, fierce, clever girls. And this does not contain that. She is not clever and curious and fierce. She is passive. Let's just say she's not walking across Sydney for Jonathan Crowe, even if he is an ass. And because she's not, it actually lessens the book even further. Not only is it the wrong place, or not a good evocation of place, it's also not a great representation of Australian character. So that is something that, if you are wanting to write that great Australian novel, which this will help you with, keep that in mind. There are actual tropes that exist within Australian literary fiction, and a very, very strong sense of place is one of them. You cannot get away, and this is what a lot of writers will attempt. They will attempt this because they think, oh, Australia's so boring, it's so bland, don't need to do that. No, actually, to make it Australian, you need to be highly, highly specific. You need to tell me about place. Australia is about place, about country. Okay? Making it nebulous often, or getting it wrong so that it doesn't evoke the place, makes it a weaker work. So I'm not going to, I'm not sitting here to rip past Delia Falconer. She wrote a book, she got it published, it's still in print. Good for her. It's just not for me. But I do think it is a very good illustration of what happens when you do not evoke place well. Place and the way that people work in place is very important. Remember our lessons from Patrick White? The physicality of Australia is important, and you don't get the physicality of living in this country if you don't have a place to be. We are not a country of temperate, comfortable, cozy. We are a country of floods and fires and heat and cold and everything in between, and humidity up the wazoo. So, and don't send people walking up hills that you can't walk up. Honestly, there's always a way around. So that's something that I'd like you to think about when it comes to writing your great Australian novel. Think about place. Think about how you are going to use place in your novel and how it's going to, what you want it to evoke. So until we meet again, I'll see you again later. And I'll bring you some more adventures from Australian literature. So, bye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.